Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're doing another installment of the weekly meta breakdown where we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder. This video is going to be for the standard best of one format. If you're looking for best of three, explore historic, alchemy, check out the playlist. We try to cover each and every one every week. As always, for the standard best of one, we get the data from UntappedGG, what you see on the screen. Companion tool that aggregates like your win rate with other users, gives us a whole bunch of cool stats in terms of popularity, win rates, card selection, stuff of that nature. Link is in the description if you want to get started with Untapped, and I will paste all these deck lists, including timestamps, in the video. Given it's like midway through the month, we can focus on Mythic rank only. So kind of the top of the top, midway through the month is a good time to start looking at it because there's a decent amount of folks who have passed the Mythic threshold. So we're going to start with popularity, and then we'll look into the games themselves. So popularity, Mono Red continues to be the most popular deck at about 19%. I believe it slightly came down if we look at the percentage. Been hovering actually. We had it as like 20s, and then it's kind of been around this like 18-19%. Kind of interested, like right after the ladder reset, it kind of fell but came back up. So Mono Red, the most popular at 19%. Mono White Humans, another aggressive slanted deck at about just under 10% at 10%. Golgari Midrange, just under 8. Then we have like Selesnya Enchantments, Azorius Control, Mono Blue Tempo, Esper Control, 4-color Control, which is the domain ramp deck. So one thing that you kind of want to consider when you're looking at this kind of distribution is the fact that you're most predominantly about 1 in 3 games going to run into a linear aggro deck. So the way you kind of construct is you need to be mindful of that. So if you are porting over some decks in like best of 3 format, you may want to reconsider certain card choices. Things like I've seen some of the Golgari decks play Terra Sunder, which good in best of 3 because you're running into more ramp, more control, like the Bant control decks. I think it's worse in best of 1 because it's oftentimes just going to have to be like a 4-mana removal spell. When your opponent's playing like Swift Spheres and stuff like that, it's not great. While you can hit the occasional Kumano on one, it's already done like a point of damage, and you're still paying 2 mana to deal with a 1-mana spell kind of effect. So things to kind of consider like that. The rest is another card you may or may not want. In the main board, you may want more cards that proactively play to the board. Just looking at like the trend, nothing too staggering. We see kind of like flush, basically just Mono White's been dropping for the last little week. We've seen it kind of on par with the Mono Red decks, and it's kind of fallen down. And it's almost on par with like the Golgari deck. So interesting kind of trend there. At one point, like the Mono Red deck had a win rate of 76%, which is kind of impressive, kind of coming through there. So if we hop in, we are going to be looking October 15th through to the 22nd, Mythic to Mythic rank, and 28,000 games played. The top performing deck is at 67%. It's a throwback. We have Azorius Soldiers, and this is a deck construction that's more akin to the older way Soldiers was built. We see a lot of the Soldiers decks in best of 3 now opt to not play Myrel, Sky Strike, Siege Veteran. They're on the Ranger of Eos. They're on the Flash package. They're on No Valiant Veteran. In best of 1, while like the counter spells can be helpful in best of 3, we're more sweepers and stuff like that. Just sheer kind of power and like brute force, especially with the Lord effects, does have a good amount of pressure that you can put on your opponent. So your 1-drops, Recruitment Officer, Yodian Frontliner, Harbin lets you go kind of over the top. Thalia as your tax, Resolute Reinforcement, 2 bodies in 1. Your Veteran as a Lord effect, and then a pump from your graveyard. Siege Veterans put counters and is kind of removal insurance. Sky Strike Officer's card advantage, and another way to kind of go wide. Brutal Cathar's removal, and then Myrel's kind of answer immediately, or it's going to take over the game. And then the kind of Grand Abolisher style effect of forcing your opponent to do things on their turn has a lot of utility, especially against like counter spells, stuff like that. Sticking in Myrel against Mono Blue feel really sweet. Fortified Beachhead in the mana base for some utility. Sometimes you'll see like Myrex out of these, but just the Beachheads in this version here kind of coming through. We then go to Mono White Humans at 62%. So Mono White surpassed Mono Red in terms of win rate this week. There's some overlap in terms of the creatures. While not all soldier focused, there is the human element. So you still have like the recruitment officers, Thalias in here. the Brutal Cathars, but this version here is playing more around humans, so you have things like Coppercoat Vanguard as your lord, and as well as Intrepid Adversary that can be picked and increase the power of your creatures. Like I said, Recruitment Officers card advantage, Hopeful Initiate blows up artifacts or enchantments, Scrolls for protection, a couple copies of Spellbook Vendor, just as I always joke, it's Luminarch Aspirant at home, just a way to kind of buff up your team, set up some scry. Just once you kind of dump your hand with this deck, there's not a lot of card advantage outside of like the Recruitment Officer, so the Vendor, at least with the scry, is kind of like pseudo advantage. At the very least, it lets you set up your future draws. Adelin's in here to go wide. Peacekeepers as kind of hand hate, Extraction Specialist for the heavier removal decks. You can rebuy things. The lifelink from both this and Intrepid Adversary can be useful in more aggressive mirrors, where you can kind of race them and offset your life total. Knight Errant Eos for some card advantage, plays nicely with the various creatures with vigilance, whether it be Spellbook Vendor, Adelin, or Anointed Peacekeepers. Let you attack in and then afterwards attack to get some card advantage. Single copy of Virtue of Loyalty as kind of your top end, and then 2 Mishra's Foundries as utility lands. Moving on, we go to Mono Red, 60% at 260 games played, and nothing like too big of a change. Like what we're seeing is the Charming Scoundrels come down to a single copy, an increase in the number of Feldons. In best of one, this is probably a reasonable configuration. The Feldon is better into these creature mirrors because, especially like Brutal Cathar in the first 2 decks was really the only removal, so they have to block if they want to remove it, and then that provides you some card advantage. This version's all in on the Monstrous Rage. We've seen some varied numbers of rages, some various numbers of chicks, but just a linear aggressive deck. Your 8 pieces of burn, and then Squeeze and Godric at the top end. This version is the 2 Mishra's Foundries, 1 Sokuzen at 22 lands. So another kind of, I built it different for best of 3. I was going to be playing in the Pizza Box Jankathon today with Mono Red and best of 3. My configuration was different because the best 3 meta is different, so like fewer copies of Feldon because there's a lot more leyline bindings going around, a lot more cut downs, stuff of that nature. So kind of shifting the way you kind of build the deck for the various formats. Important. Then go to Selesnya Enchantments at 59%. We'll round it up. So enchantment-based aggro version, you'll sometimes see Hallowed Haunting versions, but this one's the more aggressive with things like Kamiya Transience and Generous Visitor to buff your team. Mishiko gives a huge buff, and then you got like Audacity for trample. Calyx is another way to put counters on things, and then copy your enchantments. Single copy of Catilda. I'm still of the opinion that you should just play 3 Calyx and 2 Catildas. There's a lot of utility of Catilda. We saw 19% of the meta being mono red. Well, a giant flyer that gains life seems pretty good in that matchup. Heartweaver Harmony could double effects of your enchantments. Ossification is removal. Spirited Companion for card advantage. And then a couple copies of Skrelv. And then Jukai Naturals to reduce the cost. I'm always kind of skeptical as well. 20 lands seems a little low. I'm kind of relying on that best of 1 hand smoother to just curve out. But while the curve is fairly low, I do find this deck a little bit mana hungry at times. I played this in the past, but I usually around 21, 22 lands. Kind of prefer it around the mark. We then go to Azorius Control at 58.3%. So this is a mill variant of the deck. And basically how you're trying to win is you throw a Teresian Mindbreaker into your graveyard. It has Unearth 4, and then when it attacks, you mill half their library. You do that with a combination of Jace, which can 4 mana mill 15. Oftentimes is enough to kind of get them. Sunset Revelry is a really nice way to kind of gum up the board, gain you some life, give you some buffer time. You have some copies of the Celestis that can also be used for looting or ramping, as well as Faithful Mending that gains you life and then sets up your draws, throws the Mindbreaker in the graveyard. The only thing that I think with this deck, looking at it, I don't love Vanquish the Horde. I think it's still too slow in this format. Your opponent's snowballing that hard. Like, just play Sunfall or Depopulate. I think just having on curve, especially with things like Thalia, is more important. If Mono Red has 2 creatures out, they're putting enough pressure that you might want to sweep. If they have like a Godric and like, I don't know, Swiftspear. Or like they have a Squee maybe. 6 mana might still be too much in that case, to which Farewell is just better. I think Sunfall also provides you a win con or a blocker. It exiles as opposed to destroy. All are much more useful in terms of utility. So I'd make that switch. Maybe like one depopulate, choose Sunfalls. Myrex is an alt win condition. A couple copies of Blast Zone in the mana base as well. Then go to Naya Humans at 56%. So very similar to the mono white humans. The other colors from the Naya in the green and the red is from Malira. This gives you some protection for some of your key cards. Playing some copies of Valorous Stance as a way to either be proactive in protecting your creatures or destroy your opponent's big creatures. And then your top end is Halana and Alana. Every creature you play subsequent to it basically gets haste and a boost in power. And then Sigarda is another Anthem effect and can be another way to get some card advantage through the Coven ability. Seen some of these lists also play Sigarda, Host of Heron to give your creatures hexproof, and then play creatures off the top of your library as well. So another kind of a way to approach. You're using the Secluded Courtyards and Plaza Heroes as ways to kind of splash these off colors through your creatures. So very similar. You have like the Brutal Cathars, Adalins, Thalias, very similar in that regard. We then go to Gruul Midrange, 55%, and this is a get them big, get them counters. We have Ozolith, we have Picnic Ruiner, so you have the Stolen Goodies to put counters, so just lots of ways to kind of put counters on things, try to get them bigger, and then fling them with Voldaren Aperture ideally. No Cauldron in this one, which is sometimes sees play in these kind of like counter-based strategies, but Gala Greeters could get bigger, Teething Wormlight could get bigger, the Beast Caller gets bigger, puts counters on, Kodama gives trample to anything that's modified, the counter going on is a modification, so kind of a cool shell in this regard. Doomscar Warrior gets bigger, and then lets you kind of get some card advantage, Halana and Alana like we saw, and then the Gruff triplets on the top end. Limited All-Star card I want to see most in WoW Draft. Mana base wise, seems fairly reasonable. 24 lands, might be a little stretched with the Gruff, but it's probably a late game play anyways. But interesting to kind of see this counter theme come up this week. Then go to Golgari Midrange, 55%. If you're looking in best of 3, I did put together a sideboard guide. So if you're looking to move into the best of 3 format, that's up along with the mono red deck. So that's up on the channel. But this deck, there's a couple different versions. I like this version a little bit better because it wasn't a straight port of the best of 3 to best of 1. And I think cards like the Gix Command is much better in best of 1. Like the only card that I'm a little skeptical about is a Terra Sunder. I would likely just in best of 1 play the full cut down, go for the throw. While it's going to make you worse against the control matchup and like domain, I think largely more often than not you're dealing with these creature kind of mirrors, and that would be more effective. At the very least, I would probably cut a Terra Sunder for either like a cut down or go for the throw, depending on how you want to do it. Maybe play as a one of. You sometimes see Lore Skitter in these lists over Graveyard Trespasser. I think in best of 1 it's more reasonable to have Trespasser just given the more aggressive decks. In best of 3, just to go wide is a little bit more useful because you do tend to see more controlling based strategies. Lists are very useful, blowing up enchantments, card draw, removing counters from permanents, and then just being a really tough thing to attack into for your aggressive player stack. Basically, First Strike Death Touch kills anything before they're even able to make contact. Some Shieldrids, as well as Shieldred the Apocalypse and then Shieldred the regular, both kind of must answer threats that kind of snowball. Copy of Ashiok for some card advantage and to gum up the board, and then 3 Virtues of Persistence. Nice early removal, gains you some life, and then is a win condition on the backside. No Turtle in this one. I think the Turtle's too slow for best of 1, the Blossoming Tortoise. While decent in like the grindier best of 3 matchups, a 4 mana 3/3 while getting you a land most times is just going to get hit by like a Lightning Strike or have to trade down in terms of a lower mana creature. There's a lot of like 2 mana 3 power creatures that'll be attacking to it. Then go to the 4 color domain control, 54%. So kind of the big mana deck of the format. You're ramping with things like Topiary Stomper, the Invasions of Zendikars, Courier's Briefcases, and then to like your top end, it's like Atraxa, Herd Migration, Virtue Persistence, bunch of removal options, Sunfall, Go for the Throat, Leyline Binding. Leyline Bindings while costing 1 mana, are still a CMC of 6, so they trigger up the Beanstalk that gets you some card advantage. Same with like your Sunfalls or any of your top end cards. And then Archangel of Wrath can shoot down the aggressive decks, gain you a bunch of life in the process as well. Some Myrex as utility lands in the mana base. So kind of the big mana ramp deck. This deck's like very effective in best of 3. And could definitely be reasonable, but like it's a little soft obviously to the aggressive decks. It really depends on like, you know, are they able to enable like an early binding or virtue to kind of stop the early bleeding? Because while this is a reasonable turn 3 play, it doesn't actually block. So it's kind of just a rampant growth on turn 3. And then finally, Esper Legends, 54%, another deck that's usually pretty like better in best of 3, but this is the world's winning list. I made the comment last week. In best of 1, I would just play the Go for the Throat, the 4th copy over the Make Disappear. Single copy is not going to really be that useful, and playing to the board is more impactful. But I do like really good curves with this deck. Skrelv is for protection into either Denic or Thalia, into Rafine, into Shieldred, draw you a bunch of cards, gain you a bunch of life. Kind of going from there. These versions have opted to go with Fairy Mastermind in part to deal with like the mirrors or just your opponent drawing more cards. Not as useful, obviously, in best of 1 because there's less card draw per se. This is more for like the mirror matches in like the Esper mirrors, which are more frequent in the like best of 3 format. So you may want like more removal here. You can do some cut downs. Does kind of play worse with Thalia, but just something to kind of consider there. When it gets going, it's really good, but like obviously if your opponent plays Rafine into it, you're loving it, but not always best. Lord Skitter here gets played again for some incidental graveyard hate. They've kind of moved off Adeline. Maybe like worth trying out some Adelines. I think Adeline's reasonable as well, just because it gives you blockers, whereas the Lord Skitter, while it makes rats and makes tokens, those don't actually are like block, so it's a little worse into the creature aggro style strategies. 27 lands because you have all these utility lands, which early game help you hit your line drops. Late game, they're all spells for the. So that's it for the week. Let me know what you think. Catch you next time. Thanks for watching.